December 7th, 1941. The smouldering ruins of Battleship Row filled the horizon as Lieutenant Commander James Wilcox surveyed the devastation through bloodshot eyes. His ship, the USS Oklahoma, lay capsized in Pearl Harbor's oily waters. 8 battleships damaged or destroyed. 2,403 American lives lost. And yet, standing amid the apocalyptic scene, Wilcox made a solemn vow that would prove prophetic. They counted our ships and thought they knew our strength. They never counted our resolve. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. In the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto reportedly told his staff, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Whether he actually spoke these words remains historically disputed, but the sentiment proved devastatingly accurate. What the Japanese had failed to calculate was not just America's industrial potential, but the indomitable human spirit that would transform a crippled fleet into the mightiest naval force the world had ever seen. The arithmetic of Pearl Harbor seemed straightforward to Japanese military planners. Their coordinated attack had neutralized America's Pacific battleship force, destroying or damaging 18 ships totaling over 500,000 tons. Japanese intelligence estimated the United States possessed approximately 200 combat vessels in the Pacific, a number they believed would take years to replace. Their calculations, however, failed to account for 3 critical factors: America's staggering industrial capacity, the psychological transformation of a nation unified by attack, and perhaps most significantly, the personal determination of Pearl Harbor survivors to exact justice. Captain Daniel Crowley was below decks on the USS West Virginia when the first torpedo struck. "The ship shuddered like a wounded animal," he later recalled. "I remember thinking, this isn't a drill. This is the real thing." Crowley survived by swimming through burning oil to Ford Island, suffering second-degree burns across 30% of his body. 6 months later, despite medical recommendations for a stateside posting, he requested assignment to the USS Enterprise. "I had a debt to settle," he explained in a 1946 interview. Every Japanese ship sunk was partial payment. His sentiment echoed throughout the ranks of Pearl Harbor survivors. Lieutenant Raymond Davis watched his twin brother Richard die when a bomb penetrated Arizona's forward magazine. 2 years later, as gunnery officer aboard the destroyer USS Fletcher, Davis directed fire that sank the Japanese destroyer Hatsukaze at the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay. In his journal that night, he wrote simply, "For Richie, 1 down, many to go. The human, the dimension of America's naval resurrection began with salvage operations at Pearl Harbor itself." Chief Petty Officer Edward Raymer led a team of divers who worked in nightmarish conditions inside the capsized Oklahoma. Working by touch in complete darkness, breathing air pumped through hoses, they navigated the labyrinth of a ship turned upside down. "Every compartment was a new puzzle," Raymer wrote. "Doors became floors, ceilings became walls. We'd find bodies preserved exactly as they had been at the moment of attack, some still holding tools, others frozen in the act of running." Despite these horrors, Raymer's team helped refloat 5 sunken battleships: Nevada, California, West Virginia, Tennessee, and Pennsylvania. The psychological impact of seeing these once proud vessels return to service proved incalculable for American morale. The West Virginia, struck by 7 torpedoes and 2 bombs, rejoined the fleet in time for the Battle of Surigao Strait in October 1944, where she helped secure a decisive American victory. As these salvage miracles unfolded, American shipyards began the most remarkable industrial expansion in history. In 1940, American shipyards produced approximately 100,000 tons of naval vessels annually. By 1943, that figure had increased to 5 million tons, a 50-fold increase in just 3 years. The Kaiser shipyard in Richmond, California, shattered all production records, ultimately launching 747 ships during the war, more than one per day at peak production. The Liberty ship SS Robert E. Peary established the benchmark for speed construction, going from keel laying to launch in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 26 minutes. Workers at Kaiser's Oregon shipyard cheered as they placed the final rivet, many having worked 72 hours straight to achieve what Japanese planners had considered mathematically impossible. When informed of these production rates, Admiral Yamamoto reportedly said, "I don't believe it. No nation can build ships that quickly." The human stories behind these industrial miracles reflected America's total mobilization. Rose Monroe, who inspired the iconic Rosie the Riveter image, installed rivets on B-24 and B-29 bombers. Vera Anderson, who lost her husband at Pearl Harbor, led an all-female welding team at Mare Island Naval Shipyard. "Every weld I laid felt like revenge," she recalled. "My husband died aboard the Arizona. I couldn't bring him back, but I could help build the ships that would avenge him." The demographics of American shipyards transformed overnight. Women, who had constituted less than 1% of shipyard workers before the war, represented 35% by 1943. African Americans, largely excluded from skilled industrial jobs before Pearl Harbor, found new opportunities as the nation's priorities shifted from discrimination to production. The workforce at Kaiser's Richmond shipyard included significant numbers of Native Americans, Mexican Americans, and Chinese Americans, creating what historian Kevin Starr called a miniature American melting pot forged in the heat of crisis. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The human dimension extended beyond shipyards to the training of naval personnel. Before Pearl Harbor, the United States Naval Academy graduated approximately 600 officers annually. By 1943, through shortened courses and expanded facilities, it was commissioning over 5,000. Midshipman training, previously a 4-year program, was compressed into 12 months. Ensign William Manchester, who graduated in this accelerated program, later wrote, "We learned in 1 year what normally took 4. We studied 18 hours daily, slept 5, and spent the remaining hour eating. Wasn't education, it was force-feeding knowledge necessary for survival." Similar transformations occurred for enlisted personnel. Great Lakes Naval Training Station expanded from 16,000 recruits in 1940 to over 100,000 by 1943. Chief Petty Officer Thomas Sullivan, who lost all 3 of his sons aboard the USS Juneau, volunteered as a training instructor. "I can't bring my boys back," he told his commander, "but I can make damn sure the boys replacing them have every chance to survive." For Pearl Harbor survivors who returned to sea, the war became deeply personal. Lieutenant Commander Samuel Dealey, who had been ashore during the attack but lost 42 friends, took command of the submarine USS Harder. Before his death in 1944, Dealey sank 5 Japanese destroyers in just 11 days, earning the Medal of Honor for what naval historians consider the most remarkable submarine patrol of the war. Commander Ernest Evans, a Cherokee Indian who witnessed the Pearl Harbor attack from shore, took command of the destroyer USS Johnston. At the Battle of Samar in October 1944, Evans led his small destroyer in a suicidal charge against a vastly superior Japanese force, allowing American escort carriers to escape. As his ship sank after absorbing over 200 hits, Evans was last seen swimming through burning oil, encouraging his men. He would receive a posthumous Medal of Honor for what historian Samuel Eliot Morison called the most gallant action in naval history. The production and training miracles enabled an unprecedented naval expansion. In December 1941, the United States Navy counted 7 aircraft carriers in commission. By August 1945, that number had increased to 113. 99 fleet and escort carriers joined the fleet during the war years. Even more remarkable was destroyer production. The 171 destroyers in Service at Pearl Harbor grew to 377 by war's end. Fletcher-class destroyers, the backbone of the fleet, were commissioned at the extraordinary rate of nearly one per week during 1943. Japanese naval intelligence consistently underestimated this production miracle. A captured document from Imperial headquarters dated January 1944 predicted American shipbuilding capacity at no more than 4 fleet carriers and 20 destroyers annually. The actual figures were 15 fleet carriers and over 70 destroyers that year alone. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 at the Battle of Midway, witnessed this transformation firsthand. In June 1942, we had exactly 3 carriers in the Pacific, he noted in his memoirs. By June 1944, I commanded 15 carriers with more arriving monthly. The Japanese started the war, believing their quality would overcome our quantity. They never imagined we could achieve both. The human toll behind this transformation deserves recognition. American shipyards operated 24 hours daily in all weather conditions. Welding accidents, falls from scaffolding, and equipment failures caused over 4,000 industrial deaths during the war years. The Kaiser Richmond shipyard recorded 68 fatal accidents in 1943 alone, yet production never faltered. Dorothy Wright, whose husband died in an industrial accident at Norfolk Naval Shipyard, returned to work the following day. "Jim would have wanted me to keep building," she told her supervisor. "He died helping to win this war. I won't dishonor that by quitting." This spirit permeated the home front, creating what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. The psychological transformation extended to naval tactics and leadership. Before Pearl Harbor, American naval doctrine emphasized battleship formations and traditional line of battle engagements. The devastating attack forced an immediate re-evaluation, shifting focus to carrier aviation and submarine warfare areas, where America would develop overwhelming superiority. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who assumed command of the Pacific Fleet just days after Pearl Harbor, found a fleet in ruins but a spirit unbroken. "When I took command," he later recalled, "I found the officers and men of the Pacific Fleet burning with a desire to strike back. My task wasn't to inspire them, it was to channel their rage into effective action." Nimitz, who had not been at Pearl Harbor, recognized the special determination of survivors and deliberately integrated them throughout the rebuilding fleet. The transformation of Lieutenant Commander John Bulkley exemplifies this evolution. Before Pearl Harbor, Bulkley commanded a squadron of 6 PT boats in the Philippines, considered a backwater assignment. After the attack, his small boats became the only means to strike at Japanese naval forces. During the fall of the Philippines, Bulkley's PT boats conducted daring night raids, sank a Japanese cruiser, and eventually evacuated General MacArthur from Corregidor. Returning to the United States, Bulkley helped design improved PT boats and trained their crews before returning to combat in the European theatre. By 1945, the PT boat force he had helped develop numbered over 500 vessels that had sunk over 40 Japanese warships. From commanding 6 obsolete boats, Bulkley had helped create an entirely new dimension of naval warfare. Similar transformations occurred throughout the Navy. Commander Arleigh Burke, a junior officer at Pearl Harbor, developed revolutionary destroyer tactics that would devastate Japanese forces in the Solomon Islands. His Little Beaver's destroyer squadron sank multiple Japanese warships without losing a single American vessel. Burke's maxim, "The difference between a good officer and a great one is about 10 seconds," embodied the aggressive spirit that would characterize American naval operations. The submarines that escaped Pearl Harbor played a particularly crucial role. Commander Dudley Mush Morton transformed submarine warfare by adopting aggressive surface attacks instead of the cautious approaches favored before the war. His submarine Wahoo sank 19 Japanese ships, totaling 55,000 tons in just 5 patrols. Morton's tactics, though initially controversial, became standard doctrine throughout the submarine force. By war's end, American submarines had sank over 1,100 Japanese merchant vessels, totaling over 5 million tons, effectively strangling Japan's maritime economy. The 61 American submarines lost in combat had inflicted damage vastly disproportionate to their numbers, sinking 30% of all Japanese naval vessels destroyed during the war. The aircraft carriers that fortuitously escaped Pearl Harbor Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga formed the nucleus around which the new fleet would develop. Their air groups, comprising pilots who had trained in peacetime, became the teachers and leaders who would forge the most effective naval air force in history. Lieutenant Commander John Thash developed the Thash Weave, a defensive fighter tactic that neutralized the superior maneuverability of Japanese Zero fighters. Commander Jimmy Flatley established the first carrier night fighting units. Both had been at Pearl Harbor, and both were driven by the knowledge that American technical and tactical superiority would be necessary to overcome Japan's initial advantages in training and experience. By mid-1943, the transformation had progressed from rebuilding to overwhelming force projection. The Essex-class carriers, designed before the war but built in unprecedented numbers afterwards, formed the backbone of fast carrier task forces that projected American power across the Pacific. Each displaced 30,000 tons and carried nearly 100 aircraft, 3 times the air groups of pre-war carriers. Admiral William Bull Halsey, who had narrowly missed being at Pearl Harbor when his carrier Enterprise was delayed returning from delivering aircraft to Wake Island, commanded the Third Fleet that would eventually include over 100 warships. "Before the war, I commanded 1 carrier," Halsey noted. "By 1945, I had more carriers than the Japanese had built in their entire naval history." The human dimension of this transformation reached its apex in the naval battles of 1944. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 pitted 15 American carriers against 9 Japanese carriers. American pilots shot down over 400 Japanese aircraft while losing only 29 of their own, in what became known as the Marianas Turkey Shoot. The disparity reflected not just numerical superiority, but the qualitative improvement in American naval aviation. Lieutenant Alex Vratsiu, who shot down 6 Japanese aircraft in 8 minutes during this battle, had been a 22-year-old ensign at Pearl Harbor. "I remembered watching our battleships burning," he later recalled. 3 years later, I was part of the force that effectively ended Japanese naval aviation. The circle had closed. As 1944 progressed, American naval dominance became total. The Battle of Leyte Gulf. In October, the largest naval battle in history witnessed American forces destroy 4 Japanese carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, while losing only 3 light carriers and 3 destroyers. The salvaged Pearl Harbor battleships, West Virginia, California, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, and Maryland participated in the battle, completing a journey from near destruction to decisive victory. Ensign Roger Christensen, who had been wounded aboard West Virginia at Pearl Harbor, manned the same gun station at Leyte Gulf. "When we opened fire on the Japanese battleships, I thought about my shipmates who didn't survive. December 7th, he wrote. Every salvo we fired was for them. By 1945, American naval dominance was so complete that carrier task forces operated with virtual impunity off the Japanese home islands. Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet conducted airstrikes against Tokyo, while Admiral McCain's task force struck targets throughout the inland sea. The Pearl Harbor attack that had been intended to neutralize American naval power for at least a year had instead triggered a transformation that produced the most powerful fleet ever assembled. When Japan surrendered on September 2, 1945, the United States Navy had grown from approximately 770 combat vessels before Pearl Harbor to over 6,200, an 8-fold increase in less than 4 years. More significantly, American forces had sunk 334 Japanese warships, effectively eliminating the Imperial Japanese Navy as a fighting force. The human dimension of this accomplishment perhaps found its most poignant expression during the surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Among the American delegation stood several Pearl Harbor survivors, including Chief Petty Officer Michael Kovach, who had escaped the burning Arizona by swimming through flaming oil. As the Japanese delegation signed the surrender documents, Kovach later recalled thinking, "We came back. They never thought we would, but we did with a vengeance they never imagined possible." The transformation from devastation to dominance represented not just industrial might, but the human spirit that drove it. Admiral Nimitz, in his final wartime message to the Pacific Fleet, acknowledged this dimension. The road from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay has been long and hard. For those who began the journey amidst flames and destruction, its completion brings a special satisfaction that future generations may acknowledge but can never fully comprehend. The numbers tell the statistical story of America's naval resurrection. 7 battleships sunk or severely damaged at Pearl Harbor, all but 2 returned to service. 6 carriers in the Pacific Fleet on December 7, 1941, 99 in service by August 1945. 200 ships estimated by Japanese intelligence in 1941, over 6,200 in service when Japan surrendered. Yet statistics cannot capture the human dimension the Pearl Harbor survivors who returned to sea with a determination that transcended normal military service, the shipyard workers who set and broke production records weekly, the naval architects and engineers who designed entirely new classes of warships while existing ones were still being built, and the leaders who transformed not just the Navy's size but its fundamental approach to warfare. Commander Joseph Rochefort, whose codebreakers provided the intelligence that enabled victory at Midway, perhaps expressed it best in a message to Admiral Nimitz. "When our ships were sinking at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese forgot to sink our spirit. That oversight cost them the war." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The resurrection of American naval power after Pearl Harbor represents perhaps history's most remarkable example of national resilience and determination. The Japanese attack, intended to neutralize American naval power in the Pacific, instead catalyzed the creation of a fleet that would not merely defeat Japan, but establish unprecedented maritime dominance that would shape the post-war world. Pearl Harbor survivors who witnessed both the attack and the surrender ceremony experienced a transformational journey unparalleled in military history. From watching their fleet burn in 1941 to seeing Japanese representatives surrender aboard an American battleship in Tokyo Bay less than 4 years later, they participated in what Admiral Halsey called the most complete reversal of fortune in naval history. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The salvaged battleship USS West Virginia steamed through choppy seas toward the Japanese home islands in July 1945, a phoenix risen from the ashes of Pearl Harbor. Chief Gunner's mate Frank Lautenschlager stood at the rail, his weathered face reflecting both pride and disbelief, as he gazed at the armada surrounding his vessel, dozens of carriers, hundreds of support ships, thousands of aircraft. The very existence of this fleet defied logic. Just 3.5 years earlier, he had been trapped in a flooding compartment as his ship settled into the mud of Pearl Harbor after taking 7 torpedo hits and 2 bomb strikes. "When they pulled me out of the West Virginia, I was half dead," Lautenschlager later recalled in an oral history preserved at the Naval War College. "My lungs were scorched from breathing superheated steam, 3 ribs broken from the concussion. As they loaded me into the ambulance, I could see the ship burning, listing hard to port, water pouring in through the torpedo holes. The doctor told me she'd never sail again. Now here we are, bombarding the Japanese homeland. They counted us out too soon." Lautenschlager's story captures the essence of America's naval resurrection, a transformation from near destruction to unprecedented power that combined industrial might with human determination. While part 1 of this story examined the broad contours of this resurrection, the details reveal an even more remarkable achievement. The salvage operation at Pearl Harbor itself constituted an engineering miracle rarely acknowledged in historical accounts. When the smoke cleared on December 8th, the devastation appeared irreversible. The Oklahoma lay capsized, her keel exposed to the sky. The California and West Virginia had settled to the harbor bottom. The Nevada, severely damaged after a valiant attempt to escape the harbor, had been deliberately beached to prevent sinking in the channel. The Arizona had exploded catastrophically, killing 1,177 of her crew instantly. Standard naval practice would have written off these vessels. Salvage experts from the Bureau of Ships initially estimated that only the Pennsylvania and Tennessee, damaged but still afloat, could be returned to service within a year. The others would require complete reconstruction, a process that would consume valuable shipyard capacity better devoted to new construction. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, rejected these assessments. The psychological value of returning these ships to service justifies any effort, he wrote in a memorandum dated December 15th. The Japanese need to see the ships they thought they sank coming back to sink theirs. The salvage operation began immediately under the direction of Captain Homer Wallin. Working without specialized equipment initially, divers descended into the oil-fouled waters to assess damage. Their reports painted a grim picture. On the capsized Oklahoma, access required cutting through the bottom hull. Inside, they found compartments completely disoriented. Floors had become ceilings, ladders led sideways, and machinery hung suspended from what had been decks. Salvage diver Edward Raymer described the nightmarish conditions. Inside Oklahoma, we worked by touch in total darkness. The first compartment I entered contained floating bodies. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them bumping against my dive suit as I moved. The air I breathed came through a hose from the surface. If that hose snagged or kinked, I had maybe 2 minutes, find my way back through a labyrinth I couldn't see. Despite these conditions, the salvage teams achieved what many considered impossible. Using a combination of primitive patching techniques, massive pumps, and an ingenious counterflooding system, they refloated the Nevada by February 1942. The California followed in March, and the West Virginia in May. The Oklahoma proved more challenging. It would take until November 1943 to right her, and her damage proved too extensive for economical repair. The salvaged vessels required extensive reconstruction. The California, raised after being submerged for 3 months, was towed to Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, where workers removed her superstructure down to the main deck. Everything below had to be stripped, decontaminated, and rebuilt. Electrical systems, corroded beyond repair by saltwater immersion, were completely replaced. New machinery, gun mounts, and electronics transformed the vessel into effectively a new ship with an old hull. Arthur McRae, an electrician at Puget Sound, recalled working 16-hour shifts for months. "We'd sleep on cots in the shop, get up and go back at it," he said. Someone painted a sign that hung over the California's berth. The Japanese sank her once, but they made a mistake. They left some of us alive to raise her. The West Virginia underwent even more extensive reconstruction at Puget Sound. The shipyard completely removed her upperworks and replaced her machinery. Modern radar, fire control equipment, and additional anti-aircraft guns transformed the 1920s battleship into a modern vessel optimized for the evolving Pacific War. When she rejoined the fleet in July 1944, only her basic hull form resembled the ship that had burned at Pearl Harbor. While these engineering miracles unfolded, the human dimension of resurrection continued throughout the fleet. Pearl Harbor survivors dispersed throughout the Navy, bringing with them both technical expertise and psychological determination that transformed the service. Many requested assignment to new construction vessels, where they could apply lessons learned during the attack. Lieutenant William Billett, damage control officer on the capsized Oklahoma, helped design improved watertight compartmentation for the new Essex-class carriers. His innovations, including redesigned electrical distribution systems and more accessible damage control equipment, would save numerous vessels damaged in kamikaze attacks late in the war. Chief Fire Controlman Dennis Rowland, blown overboard from the Arizona, became an instructor at the Fire Control School in Washington. The training program he developed incorporated direct combat experience and significantly improved the accuracy of American naval gunfire. By 1944, American vessels could achieve first salvo hits at ranges exceeding 20,000 yards, a capability that proved decisive in numerous surface and engagements. Captain Mitchell Ellis, who commanded the destroyer USS Monaghan during the attack, applied lessons from Pearl Harbor as commander of Destroyer Division 22 during the Solomon Islands campaign. The aggressive torpedo tactics his destroyers employed at the Battle of Cape Esperance resulted in the sinking of the Japanese cruiser Furutaka and destroyer Fubuki with minimal American losses. At Pearl Harbor, we were passive targets, Ellis wrote in his action report after Cape Esperance. We swore never to be passive again. Tonight, we attacked before the enemy could fully deploy. We determined the range and time of engagement rather than responding to their initiative. This psychological shift from defensive to offensive mindset represents our most important victory. The resurrection narrative extended beyond combat vessels to the vital but often overlooked auxiliary fleet. Before Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy possessed just 60 fleet oilers capable of underway replenishment. By war's end, that number had increased to 417, enabling the operational endurance that made sustained carrier operations possible thousands of miles from established bases. Lieutenant Commander Arleigh Burke, who would later rise to Chief of Naval Operations, identified this capability as America's most significant naval advantage. The Japanese designed a navy that could win decisive battles, he observed. We built a navy that could maintain station indefinitely. Their carriers could operate for maybe 10 days before returning to port for fuel and supplies. Ours could remain at sea for months, supported by our service force. That's how we maintained constant pressure while they could only mount periodic operations. The Mobile Logistics Service Force that supported American fleet operations in the Western Pacific by 1945 constituted a navy in itself. 121 tankers, 40 refrigerated stores, ships, 39 aircraft transports, and dozens of repair vessels, floating dry docks, and hospital ships. This service force allowed continuous operations that Japanese naval doctrine, based on limited duration sorties from home waters, could not match. Commander Carleton Wright, who survived the sinking of the cruiser Helena at the Battle of Kula Gulf, later commanded Service Squadron 10 that supported operations in the Philippine campaign. The Japanese never understood our logistics, he wrote. They would see our carriers withdraw after strikes and assume they were returning to Pearl Harbor or even the West Coast. In reality, they were meeting our service force just over the horizon, taking on fuel and replacement aircraft, and returning within days. The expansion of naval aviation represented another dimension of America's naval resurrection. Before Pearl Harbor, the Navy possessed 7 aircraft carriers with approximately 500 combat aircraft. By August 19, 45 27 fleet carriers and 86 escort carriers operated over 15,000 aircraft, a 30-fold increase in aviation capability. This expansion required not just industrial capacity, but human capital development on an unprecedented scale. Before the war, naval aviators received nearly 3 years of training before carrier qualification. By 1942, the Navy had compressed this program to 8 months through a ruthlessly efficient selection and training system. The sacrifice this accelerated program required appears in the statistics. 1,100 naval aviators died in training accidents between 1942 and 1945. Lieutenant Commander John Crommelin, who supervised carrier qualification training, captured the tragic necessity in a memorandum to the Bureau of Personnel. We lose pilots in training so that more will survive in combat. Every error they make against us in practice is one they won't make against the enemy. Despite these compressed timelines, American naval aviators achieved qualitative superiority over their Japanese counterparts by 1944. While Japan struggled to replace experienced pilots lost at Midway and in the Solomon Islands, the American training pipeline produced over 21,000 naval aviators during the war years. This quantitative advantage, combined with qualitative improvements in aircraft design, created overwhelming air superiority. Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare exemplified this transformation. The son of an attorney associated with Al Capone, who was later murdered, likely for cooperating with federal authorities, O'Hare received his wings in May 1940, part of the last pre-war naval aviator class, to complete the full training program. On February 20, 1942, while flying from the carrier Lexington, O'Hare single-handedly engaged 9 Japanese bombers, shooting down 5 and damaging a 6th, thereby preventing a potentially devastating attack on his ship. This action earned O'Hare the Medal of Honor and made him the Navy's first air combat hero of the war. More importantly, it inspired a new generation of naval aviators. By 1943, O'Hare commanded Air Group 6 aboard the USS Independence, where he developed innovative night fighting tactics before his death in combat in November 1943. The young pilots he trained formed the nucleus of the night fighting expertise that would prove decisive in 1944. Chicago's O'Hare International Airport would later be named in his honor, but his legacy lives most significantly in the combat doctrine he helped establish. One of his innovations, the Big Blue Blanket, concept of maintaining continuous fighter coverage over the fleet, effectively neutralized Japanese air attacks during the Philippine campaign. The submarine force experienced perhaps the most dramatic transformation in ADT peace: combat effectiveness. Pre-war doctrine had emphasized fleet support operations submarines operating as scouts and pickets for the battle line. Pearl Harbor forced an immediate shift to independent commerce raiding against Japan's vulnerable supply lines. Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton exemplified the aggressive new approach. Taking command of USS Wahoo in 1942, Morton immediately announced his operating philosophy: "Wahoo is expendable. We will take every reasonable risk to sink enemy ships." In 5 war patrols, Wahoo sank 19 confirmed enemy vessels, totaling 55,000 tons, before being lost with all hands in October 1943. Morton's legacy lived on through his executive officer, Richard O'Kane, who applied the same aggressive tactics as commander of USS Tang. Before Tang's loss, in October 1944, when struck by one of her own torpedoes that circled back, O'Kane had sunk 31 ships, displacing 227,000 tons, the highest total for any American submarine commander. The submariners paid a terrible price for this effectiveness. 52 American submarines and 3,505 submariners were lost, the highest casualty rate of any U.S. military branch. Yet their impact proved decisive. By war's end, American submarines had sunk 1,113 Japanese merchant ships, totaling over 5 million tons, effectively cutting Japan off from the resources needed to sustain its war effort. Captain Charles Lockwood, who commanded Submarine Force Pacific for most of the war, assessed their contribution. "Our submarines constituted less than 2% of the U.S. Navy's total personnel, but sank over 30% of all Japanese warships destroyed and 60% of their merchant marine. No force in naval history has produced results so disproportionate to its size." The amphibious forces experienced perhaps the most dramatic expansion of any naval component. Before Pearl Harbor, the United States Marine Corps possessed virtually no specialized landing craft and limited amphibious doctrine. By 1945, the Navy operated over 50,000 landing craft of various types, supported by 2,300 specially designed support vessels, including landing ship tanks, LSTs, landing craft infantry, LCIs, and amphibious command ships. The scale of this expansion becomes clear in specific operations. The Guadalcanal landings in August 1942 involved 82 landing craft. The Normandy landings in June 1944 employed over 4,000. The Okinawa operation in April 1945 utilized over 6,000 specialized amphibious vessels, more than the entire pre-war Navy. This amphibious capability enabled the island-hopping strategy that brought American forces within striking distance of Japan. Each operation built upon lessons from previous landings, creating an institutional expertise that minimized casualties while maximizing effectiveness. The final amphibious operations of 1945 reflected a level of coordination between naval, air, and ground forces that would have been unimaginable in 1941. Captain Victor Krulak, who observed the disastrous British landings at Gallipoli as a case study while developing American amphibious doctrine, later reflected, "We transformed amphibious operations from the most hazardous military undertaking to a nearly routine capability. The Japanese, who believed their island defenses made invasion suicidal, never adapted to our evolving techniques. By 1944, we could land anywhere we chose with relative impunity." The naval construction battalions, the famous Seabees, represented another dimension of America's naval resurrection. Created after Pearl Harbor, these units combined civilian construction skills with military training. By war's end, 325,000 Seabees had built over 400 advanced bases across the Pacific. Their accomplishments bordered on the miraculous. On captured islands like Tinian, Seabees transformed jungle airstrips into B-29 bases in weeks rather than months. At Espiritu Santo, they created a major fleet anchorage where none had existed. On Okinawa, they built an advanced naval base while the battle still raged inland. Commander Robert Steele, who led the 7th Naval Construction Brigade at Okinawa, captured their ethos. The difference between impossible and possible is just a matter of how badly you want to get it done. When a ship captain tells me he needs a pier by Thursday to unload ammunition for the front lines, my only question is whether he wants it Wednesday night or Thursday morning. By 1945, the US Navy had established the most extensive network of forward bases in naval history. From these facilities, American naval power could be projected against the Japanese homeland with a sustained intensity that had no historical precedent. The Ulithi anchorage, constructed entirely during the war on an obscure atoll in the Caroline Islands, could simultaneously accommodate over 600 vessels, more than the entire pre-war Navy. Admiral Raymond Spruance, perhaps the most underrated naval commander of the war, recognized the significance of this logistical miracle. "History will remember our carriers and battleships," he wrote, "but the war was won by our service forces, the tankers, ammunition ships, and repair vessels that kept us operating thousands of miles from Pearl Harbor. The Japanese never understood how we sustained operations so far from our main bases, because they had never developed comparable capabilities. The culmination of America's naval resurrection came during the final campaigns of 1945. Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa, involved 1,300 naval vessels, including 40 carriers, 18 battleships, and 200 amphibious ships. This armada, which dwarfed the combined fleets of all other nations, supported a landing force of over 180,000 troops. For comparison, the total Japanese Navy on December 7, 1941, consisted of fewer than 400 combat vessels. The American force assembled for just this single operation in April 1945 was more than 3 times larger. The ships bombarding Japanese positions at Okinawa included the salvaged Pearl Harbor battleships, Tennessee, Maryland, West Virginia, and Nevada, their presence representing the completion of a circle from devastation to dominance. Captain William Ingram, gunnery officer aboard the Tennessee, wrote in his action report, "When we commenced firing on the Japanese shore positions, I thought of our ship as she had been on December 7th, burning, damaged, trapped at her berth. Today, we delivered over 400 14-inch shells onto enemy positions with methodical precision. The Japanese believed they had eliminated us as a fighting force. They were wrong." By August 1945, American naval dominance had reached levels that maritime historians struggle to quantify. Task Force 38, operating off the Japanese home islands, included 15 fleet carriers, 5 light carriers, 8 battleships, 15 cruisers, and over 50 destroyers. This single formation possessed more combat power than the combined fleets of the rest of the world. When news of the Japanese surrender reached this task force on August 15, 1945, Captain Thomas Maurer, commanding the carrier Intrepid, addressed his crew. 4 years ago, they struck us without warning. Today, our aircraft fly unopposed over their homeland. 4 years ago, their carriers ruled the Pacific. Today, ours steam within sight of Mount Fuji. There is no more complete victory in naval history, no more total vindication of sacrifice. For the Pearl Harbor survivors who witnessed both the attack and the surrender, the emotional impact transcended normal military experience. Master Chief Petty Officer Stuart Mason had been a 19-year-old seaman aboard the Nevada during the attack. Nearly 4 years later, as a senior non-commissioned officer, he stood on the deck of the Missouri during the surrender ceremony. Looking across Tokyo Bay at all those ships, our ships, I couldn't help but think of how impossible this would have seemed on December 8, 1941, he later recalled. Standing there in my dress whites, watching the Japanese officials sign the surrender documents, I felt my eyes filling with tears. Not for myself, but for the men who weren't there, the ones who didn't make it to see this day. We'd done it for them, really. They were the ones who paid for this victory. The final statistics tell an astonishing story. 334 Japanese warships sunk versus just under 100 American warships lost in combat. Japanese merchant shipping virtually eliminated, with over 5 million tons sunk. American shipbuilding had produced over 6,200 new naval vessels during the war years, an average of 4 per day for 4 years. Yet behind these statistics lies the human story, the Pearl Harbor survivors who channeled their grief and rage into determined action. The shipyard workers who set production records only to break them the following week. The naval architects who designed entirely new vessel classes while existing ones were still in production. And the leaders who transformed not just the Navy's size, but its fundamental approach to warfare. Admiral Chester Nimitz, whose quiet leadership had guided much of this transformation, perhaps expressed it most eloquently in a message to the Pacific Fleet on the day of Japan's surrender. The long and difficult road from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay has been traveled, with blood, determination, and American ingenuity. Today, the guns are silent, and our hearts go out to those who gave their lives to reach this day. History will record many reasons for our victory, but none more important than the courage and character of the American sailors who refused to accept defeat when it seemed most certain. The resurrection of American naval power after Pearl Harbor remains the greatest comeback story in military history, a transformation from devastating defeat to absolute victory, driven by industrial might, technological innovation, and most importantly, human determination that refused to accept the possibility of failure. The Missouri's teak deck gleamed in the early morning sunlight as dignitaries assembled for the surrender ceremony in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945. Among them stood Commander Thomas Kirkpatrick, who had survived the destruction of the USS Arizona nearly 4 years earlier. As a junior officer, he had been blown from the ship's bridge when her forward magazine exploded, killing 1,177 of his shipmates instantly. Now, watching Japanese representatives approach the surrender table aboard an American battleship anchored in their home waters, Kirkpatrick experienced what he would later describe as the most profound moment of my life. Standing there, I could see the entire war compressed into a single instant, he recalled in a 1975 oral history. From the burning hulks at Pearl Harbor to this assemblage of American power in Tokyo Bay, the most complete reversal of fortune in military history. The Japanese had gambled everything on that single strike, believing it would break our will. Instead, it forged us into something they couldn't have imagined. The surrender ceremony capped a transformation so complete that many historians struggle to capture its full dimensions. The statistical resurrection from 8 battleships damaged or sunk at Pearl Harbor to over 100 capital ships in Tokyo Bay represents only the visible manifestation of a deeper metamorphosis. America's true achievement lay in the creation of an entirely new approach to naval warfare, one that integrated air, surface, subsurface, and amphibious capabilities into a cohesive doctrine that rendered traditional naval concepts obsolete. The human dimension of this transformation reveals itself in the stories of individuals who spanned both defining moments of the Pacific War. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort had been a crypto-analyst at Pearl Harbor, working desperately to decode Japanese messages before the attack. By war's end, he had created the intelligence apparatus that made America's devastating submarine campaign possible. His team tracked Japanese merchant shipping with such precision that American submarines often knew the cargo, route, and escort composition of vessels before they departed Japanese ports. In 1941, we were fighting blind, Rochefort noted in a classified post-war assessment. By 1944, we had achieved what can only be called total information dominance. We routinely read Japanese operational orders before the commanders tasked with executing them. This intelligence advantage multiplied our combat power beyond mere numbers. This intelligence transformation paralleled equally profound changes in naval aviation. Lieutenant Stanley Johnston had been a fighter pilot with just 70 flight hours when Pearl Harbor occurred. By war's end, as commander of Air Group 16 aboard the carrier Randolph, he had accumulated over 700 combat hours and developed innovative multi-carrier strike tactics that Japanese defenses could not counter. "We completely reimagined naval air power," Johnston wrote in 1946. Before Pearl Harbor, carriers operated independently, launching small strikes with limited objectives. By 1945, we routinely coordinated over 1,000 aircraft from multiple carrier groups in single operations. The Japanese never adapted to this scale of aerial warfare. The transformation extended to medical capabilities, an aspect of naval resurrection rarely noted in historical accounts. Pearl Harbor had overwhelmed available medical facilities, with wounded sailors treated on lawns and in hallways of overwhelmed hospitals. By Operation Iceberg, the Okinawa campaign, the Navy had developed a sophisticated echelon-based casualty treatment system that saved countless lives. Hospital apprentice first class, Raymond Estes had been a pharmacist's mate at the Pearl Harbor Naval Hospital during the attack. By 1945, as a chief pharmacist's mate aboard the hospital ship Solace, he oversaw trauma care that incorporated innovations developed through 4 years of brutal experience. Mortality rates for seriously wounded sailors had dropped from 38% in early 1942 to sitting under 12% by war's end. At Pearl Harbor, we were overwhelmed, improvising with whatever we had, Estes recalled. By Okinawa, we had floating hospitals with capabilities rivaling stateside facilities, dedicated casualty evacuation aircraft, forward surgical teams, and blood supplies positioned throughout the fleet. We'd transformed naval medicine from the age of gangrene and amputations to modern trauma care. This systematic improvement characterized every aspect of naval operations. Damage control, the art of saving wounded ships, underwent revolutionary development. The burning, sinking vessels at Pearl Harbor had exposed critical vulnerabilities in compartmentation, firefighting equipment, and personnel training. By 1945, American warships incorporated design features and equipment specifically developed to survive battle damage. The Fletcher-class destroyers, which formed the backbone of the surface fleet by war's end, exemplified these improvements. With redundant fire mains, improved watertight integrity, and crews extensively trained in damage control, these vessels demonstrated remarkable survivability. USS Laffey absorbed 4 bomb hits and 6 kamikaze crashes off Okinawa, yet remained afloat and operational damage that would have sunk any pre-war destroyer. Captain Frederick Sherman, who had been damage control officer aboard the cruiser Helena when the war began and finished as commander of Destroyer Division 62, noted the transformation. In 1941, we approached damage control as an unfortunate necessity. By 1945, it had become a specialized discipline with dedicated officers, equipment, and training that saved dozens of ships that would otherwise have been lost. The human stories behind these improvements often trace directly to Pearl Harbor. Lieutenant Commander Herbert Farr had been trapped in a flooding compartment aboard California during the attack. After escaping through a small access trunk, he dedicated himself to improving shipboard damage control. The Farr flooding manifold he designed allowed rapid isolation of damaged sections without losing propulsion capability, an innovation credited with saving numerous vessels struck by kamikaze attacks. The resurrection extended to shipboard habitability, a factor rarely considered in combat effectiveness, but vital for sustained operations. Pre-war vessels had limited air conditioning, rudimentary food storage, and primitive sanitation systems that significantly degraded crew effectiveness during extended deployments. By war's end, American warships incorporated environmental systems that maintained combat efficiency in tropical conditions. The Essex-class carriers that formed the core of American striking power by 1944 featured extensive air conditioning, improved food preparation facilities, and water distillation systems that produced 60,000 gallons daily. These seemingly mundane improvements enabled sustained operations in the Western Pacific that Japanese forces, lacking similar capabilities, could not match. Commander Wilson Starbuck, who served as engineering officer aboard the carrier Essex, noted the operational impact. The Japanese designed ships that could fight intense battles for short periods. We built vessels that could maintain combat operations indefinitely. After 2 weeks at sea in tropical waters, our pilots still had clean bedding, fresh food, and cool spaces for rest between missions. Japanese aircrews, operating from stifling ships without adequate refrigeration or water supplies, experienced rapid degradation in performance. The technological dimensions of naval resurrection extended far beyond ship design. Radar, barely operational at Pearl Harbor, evolved into a comprehensive electronic warfare system that provided decisive advantages. By 1945, American vessels operated integrated air search, surface search, and fire control radars that enabled detection and engagement of targets beyond visual range in any weather conditions. The Combat Information Center, CIC, a specialized space for processing radar data and coordinating operations, represented one of the war's most significant innovations. Non-existent in 1941, by war's end, every major combatant featured a CIC that integrated information from multiple sensors to create what would now be called battle space awareness. Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes, who had served at the Pearl Harbor Naval Intelligence Center and later helped develop CIC doctrine, described the transformation. Before Pearl Harbor, naval combat remained essentially visual. You fought what you could see. By 1945, we operated in an electronic environment, engaging targets over the horizon using information assembled from multiple sources. The Japanese never developed comparable capabilities. Communications systems underwent equally dramatic evolution. The attack on Pearl Harbor had exposed critical vulnerabilities in command and control. Many vessels lost communication capability within minutes, hampering damage control efforts and coordinated response. By war's end, American warships featured redundant radio systems, secure voice communications, and automated encryption devices that maintained command integrity even under intense attack. The human dimension of this technological transformation appears in the story of Lieutenant Edward Gallagher. As communications officer aboard Nevada during the Pearl Harbor attack, he had maintained the only operational radio circuit from a battleship, allowing coordination with shore batteries during the vessel's attempted sortie. By war's end, as Fleet Communications Officer for Task Force 38, he oversaw a network handling over 5,000 messages daily, coordinating operations across thousands of square miles. At Pearl Harbor, we struggled to communicate between ships, moored a few hundred yards apart, Gallagher recalled. By 1945, we routinely coordinated simultaneous airstrikes, surface actions, and amphibious landings across entire regions. The Japanese, who never developed comparable communications capabilities, couldn't understand how we maintained such operational coherence across vast distances. Fire control systems, the complex apparatus that aimed naval guns, experienced revolutionary development. Pre-war systems relied primarily on optical rangefinders, vulnerable to poor visibility and battle damage. By 1945, American warships employed radar-directed fire control that could achieve first salvo hits at ranges exceeding 20,000 yards in any weather conditions. The Mark 37 director system, deployed on most major warships by mid-1943, integrated optical and radar inputs with mechanical computers to automatically track targets and calculate firing solutions. This system enabled American surface forces to open effective fire beyond visual range, a capability that proved decisive in night engagements in the Solomon Islands. Commander William Rogers, who had served as gunnery officer aboard the cruiser San Francisco during the naval Battle of Guadalcanal, noted the impact. In our first night actions, we were essentially firing blindly, relying on visual sightings and star shells for illumination. By 1944, we could detect, track, and hit Japanese vessels before they knew we were present. The technology gap became insurmountable. The resurrection extended to mundane but crucial aspects of naval architecture. Pre-war vessels featured minimal air conditioning, primarily in sensitive spaces like radio rooms. By 1945, comprehensive environmental control systems maintained habitable conditions throughout major combatants, enabling sustained combat efficiency in tropical climates that significantly degraded Japanese performance. The Fletcher-class destroyers again exemplified this evolution. With 5,000 cubic feet per minute of air conditioning capacity, compared to 0 in pre-war destroyers, these vessels maintained effective crew performance during extended operations in equatorial waters. Similar improvements in refrigeration, water distillation, and sanitation systems sustained combat effectiveness during deployments that would have rapidly degraded personnel in earlier vessels. Commander Raymond Tarbuck, who served aboard 6 different destroyers during the war, noted the operational impact. In 1942, aboard older destroyers, after a week at sea in the Solomon Islands, the crew was physically exhausted from heat and humidity. By 1944, in the Philippines aboard Fletcher-class ships, we could maintain peak efficiency indefinitely. The Japanese never developed similar habitability, and it showed in their declining combat performance during extended operations. The organizational transformation matched the technological evolution. Pre-war naval doctrine emphasized decisive battle between opposing main battle lines, a concept derived from Mahan's theories of sea power and exemplified by the battleship-centric fleet. Pearl Harbor instantly rendered this doctrine obsolete, forcing rapid adaptation to carrier-centric warfare, distributed operations, and combined arms approaches. Admiral Raymond Spruance embodied this transformation. A surface warfare specialist commanding cruisers before the war, he assumed command of Task Force 16, built around the carrier Enterprise, just before the Battle of Midway, when the original commander fell ill. Despite minimal carrier experience, Spruance made the crucial decision to launch a full strike against the Japanese carriers before they could recover their initial attack wave, a decision that resulted in the destruction of 4 enemy carriers within minutes. By 1945, as commander of the Fifth Fleet, Spruance orchestrated operations involving hundreds of ships across thousands of square miles, a scale of command unimaginable before Pearl Harbor. His methodical planning and calm decision-making established standards for naval operational art that remain relevant in modern doctrine. Pearl Harbor forced us to reimagine naval warfare completely, Spruance observed after the war. Our pre-war concepts proved instantly obsolete, requiring us to develop entirely new approaches while simultaneously fighting a determined enemy. That we accomplished this transformation while extending our operational reach across the Pacific represents our greatest achievement. The naval intelligence apparatus underwent equally profound transformation. Before Pearl Harbor, intelligence collection relied primarily on reports from naval attachés, open-source information, and limited signals intercepts. By war's end, a sophisticated network integrated human intelligence, signals intelligence, photographic reconnaissance, and captured documents to create comprehensive operational pictures. The Joint Intelligence Center Pacific Ocean Areas, JICPOA, established at Pearl Harbor after the attack, grew from a small analytical cell to an organization employing over 1,000 specialists by 19 persons. 45. Their products included detailed topographic models of landing beaches, comprehensive order of battle estimates, and operational patterns that enabled precision targeting of enemy vulnerabilities. Commander Thomas Dyer, who had been a junior intelligence officer at Pearl Harbor and finished the war heading JICPOA's analytical section, described the evolution. In 1941, we struggled to identify Japanese naval units and predict their movements. By 1945, we monitored individual ships, tracked their cargo and fuel status, and often knew their operational orders before they sailed. This transformation from intelligence scarcity to comprehensive awareness represented a revolution in military information. The resurrection narrative extends even to the psychological dimension. Pearl Harbor inflicted a profound psychological shock that might have demoralized a lesser force. Instead, it catalyzed a transformation in fighting spirit, characterized by what Admiral William Halsey called calculated aggressiveness, a determination to seize initiative despite material disadvantages. This spirit manifested in early carrier raids against Japanese-held islands operations with minimal strategic impact but enormous psychological value. The Doolittle raid of April 18, 1942, launching 16 B-25 bombers from the carrier Hornet to strike Tokyo, exemplified this approach. Though militarily insignificant, the raid demonstrated American resilience and shocked Japanese leadership, who had assured their population that the home islands were invulnerable. Lieutenant Ted Lawson, one of the Doolittle raiders, later wrote, "The value wasn't in the minimal damage we inflicted, but in proving America could and would strike back despite overwhelming odds. We demonstrated that Pearl Harbor had strengthened rather than broken our resolve, a psychological victory far exceeding the physical results. This aggressive spirit permeated all levels of naval operations. Lieutenant Commander Howard Gilmore, commanding the submarine Growler, exemplified this determination during a surface engagement with a Japanese patrol vessel on February 7, 1943. Wounded during the ramming of the enemy ship and unable to reach the submarine's hatch before it had to dive, Gilmore ordered, "Take her down," sacrificing his life to save his crew. His final command became a watchword throughout the submarine service. By war's end, this spirit had evolved from desperate courage to methodical dominance. Captain Arleigh Burke, whose destroyer squadron earned the nickname Little Beavers for aggressive, actions in the Solomon Islands expressed this evolution. In 1942, we fought with determination born of anger and the need to prove ourselves. By 1945, we fought with the calm confidence of absolute superiority. The Japanese started this war believing in their invincibility. They ended it knowing ours. The material dimension of naval resurrection inevitably dominates historical accounts. The industrial miracle that produced over 100 aircraft carriers, 364 destroyers, and more than 55,000 landing craft within 4 years remains unprecedented in manufacturing history. Yet the human dimension, the sailors, officers, and civilians who operated this vast machine, represents the more profound transformation. Pearl Harbor survivors dispersed throughout the expanding fleet, bringing with them both technical expertise and psychological determination that influenced the entire service. As the Navy expanded from approximately 340,000 personnel in December 1941 to over 3,300,000 by August 1945, these veterans established standards, traditions, and expectations that shaped the service's character. Chief Petty Officer Raymond Spruance had been a machinist's mate aboard the repair ship Vestal during the attack. Thrown into the burning waters of Pearl Harbor when Japanese bombs struck his vessel, he suffered burns over 30% of his body. Released from the hospital in March 1942, he declined disability discharge and requested assignment to the new Essex-class carriers entering service. By 1944, as chief machinist's mate aboard Yorktown, he supervised an engineering division composed primarily of teenagers with minimal pre-service mechanical experience. His insistence on exacting standards and his personal example of determination established a template replicated throughout the fleet, as experienced veterans molded millions of new recruits into effective sailors. The kids coming aboard in 1944 had never seen combat, Spruance recalled. But they had seen us, the Pearl Harbor survivors, with our scars and our nightmares. We didn't have to tell them what the stakes were. They could see it in our eyes. And they understood that our standards weren't arbitrary, they were the difference between survival and death. This human dimension extended to leadership philosophy. Pre-war naval command emphasized rigid hierarchy and strict adherence to doctrine. Pearl Harbor exposed the limitations of this approach, fostering development of what Admiral Nimitz called calculated initiative, empowering subordinate commanders to adapt to rapidly changing situations within the framework of overall strategic intent. Nimitz himself exemplified this approach. Taking command of the shattered Pacific Fleet just 10 days after the attack, he found a demoralized organization with inadequate resources facing a seemingly unstoppable enemy. Rather than impose rigid control, he established clear strategic objectives while granting operational commanders substantial latitude in execution. This leadership philosophy proved decisive in the war's critical engagements. At Midway, Admiral Spruance made the crucial decision to launch strikes against the Japanese carriers without waiting for complete information, a calculated risk that resulted in the destruction of 4 enemy carriers in 5 minutes. At Leyte Gulf, Admiral Thomas Kinkaid adapted rapidly to Japanese deception operations, reallocating forces to counter threats as they developed rather than adhering to predetermined plans. By war's end, this philosophy had become institutionalized as mission command, providing subordinates with clear objectives while granting them flexibility in how to achieve them. This approach, developed under the pressures of Pacific combat, remains fundamental to American military doctrine. The resurrection narrative finds its most poignant expression in the stories of ships that spanned both defining moments of the Pacific War. The salvaged battleship Nevada, after absorbing multiple bomb and torpedo hits at Pearl Harbor, underwent extensive reconstruction at Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. Returning to service in December 1942, she supported landings in the Aleutians, Normandy, southern France, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. During the Okinawa campaign, Nevada's main battery fired over 5,000 14-inch shells at Japanese positions, more than the entire American battleship force had fired in World War I. From the devastation of December 7th to the triumph of the final campaigns, her journey embodied the Navy's transformation from victim to victor. Perhaps no vessel better symbolizes the resurrection than the aircraft carrier Enterprise. Present at Pearl Harbor but unscathed, she operated without relief during the desperate early months when she and Yorktown represented America's only operational carriers in the Pacific. Damaged repeatedly, yet returning to service after each repair, she earned 20 combat stars, more than any other American warship. By war's end, Enterprise had participated in 20 major engagements from the Doolittle raid to the final strikes against the Japanese homeland. When informed of the Japanese surrender, Admiral Halsey signaled the fleet. Enterprise has had her revenge. Her journey from witnessing the devastation at Pearl Harbor to launching the final combat sorties of the war captures the essence of American naval resurrection. The scale of transformation becomes clear through the experience of individual sailors like Seaman First Class David Reynolds. Enlisting at 17 in November 1941, he reported to Pearl Harbor for training just days after the attack. His first assignment, recovering bodies from the harbor, provided a baptism in the realities of naval warfare. By war's end, as a chief petty officer aboard the carrier Bennington, Reynolds had witnessed the complete transformation of American naval power. From the smoking ruins of Pearl Harbor to the overwhelming force assembled in Tokyo Bay, his service spanned the entire arc of resurrection. Standing on Bennington's flight deck as we entered Tokyo Bay for the surrender ceremony, I couldn't help thinking about those bodies we'd pulled from Pearl, Reynolds recalled years later. In less than 4 years, we'd gone from the worst disaster in naval history to the most complete victory. The Japanese started this war, thinking one decisive blow would break America's will to fight. They ended it having experienced what happens when you awaken a sleeping giant. The statistics tell only part of the story. 334 Japanese warships sunk versus approximately 100 American vessels lost in combat. Japanese merchant shipping effectively eliminated with over 5 million tons sunk, American shipbuilding producing over 6,000 new naval vessels during the war years, an average of 4 per day for 4 years. Yet beyond these numbers lies the human dimension, the Pearl Harbor survivors who channeled grief and rage into determined action. The industrial workers who established production records only to break them the following week. The naval architects who designed new vessel classes while existing ones remained on drafting boards, and the leaders who transformed not just the Navy's size, but its fundamental approach to warfare. Admiral Chester Nimitz, whose quiet leadership guided much of this transformation, perhaps expressed it most eloquently in his remarks aboard Missouri during the surrender ceremony. "It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. A world founded upon faith and understanding, a world dedicated to the dignity of man and the fulfillment of his most cherished wish for freedom, tolerance, and justice." From the ashes of Pearl Harbor to the sunlit deck of Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the United States Navy had completed history's most remarkable military resurrection, a transformation from devastation to dominance driven by industrial might, technological innovation, and, most importantly, and human determination that refused to accept the possibility of failure. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.